What's going on, everyone? Welcome, episode 78 of Poppet's Corner. We're going up all the way to the Bay Area. It seems like it's a familiar territory with me. Going up there over the past several guests have obviously been from that specific area, but we're going to go to my good buddy, Mr. Matt Harnett. How you doing today, sir? Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, man, Tanner, thanks so much for having me, man. It's really an honor. I mean, I don't mean that lightly, man. It's an honor to come on your show, and between what you and Andy do at Razor Radio and what you're doing here with Poppet's Corner, and of course what you do with Drost. Honor for me to be on here, man. Thanks for having me on.
So, so what I'm gonna do is, because I don't know too much about you, and as far as like you, if you're a musician or how you kind of got into the podcasting world. So I want to explore both of those. And if you don't mind, man, I would really love to get started and just kind of, I don't know, take us on a journey to how you kind of are sitting in your room as of now and talking to me. So.
That's a good question. I mean, just like, I guess all of us, I grew up, loving, hard rock and metal. I was lucky enough to have a father who had my dad was a drummer. Growing up, he was in a band. He was a huge, fan of hard rock and, and I guess I wouldn't say really metal, but he listened to like bands like Kiss and Van Halen, so like sort of the pre-metal stuff. And, so I grew up with, music around me my whole life. I grew up in New York City. And as I got older, in terms of getting involved with the music business, I do play music. I'm a bass guitarist. I've had a band. I've been in a band. Me and my brothers down in Los Angeles. We had a band for a little while. But going back to when I was a late teenager, I always just had a very strong draw to be part of the music business in terms of behind the scenes. So as growing up in New York, when I became a teenager and I graduated high school, I interned at a bunch of I interned at Roadrunner Records. That was obviously my, big thing I did back there in New York. Was I interned there for about 4 months, 4 or 5 months, right before I came and moved out here to California. That was, once you work at a place like that and you intern at a place like that with all those, not just musicians, but, unbelievable, A&R guys like, Monty Connor. He was there when I was interning and stuff. So, I just always had, I always just wanted to be involved in music, whether I was playing it or I was, promoting bands or doing whatever. It just, I just always had that passion, when I started getting older and started, exploring more music, especially underground music. And I look at these, CDs or, vinyl, whatever it was I had, cassettes. And I'd see like these record labels, I didn't know what they were. I just knew that there was something associated with all this music. And it's just one of those things, man. I'm sure it's the same with you. I mean, it's just a natural draw to it where I just knew I had to be involved in the music business in some capacity. And, so as I got older, I moved, I guess I worked at ASCAP back in New York as well. And but I always wanted to be in the West Coast. Once I came out here and I visited, man, that was just like I had to be out in California, in my mind, in terms of not just, just because it's so beautiful out here. It's also because of all the great labels and bands that were out here. I was a huge like Fear Factory fan. That was like my biggest, my favorite band in the 90s. And so when I moved out here, it was such a burgeoning scene. I mean, just a great scene in Southern California. And then, so I came out here, and then, after working at some labels, I also worked at a company called Shout Factory. It's a real, I don't know if you know who they are, but they do a lot of like anthologies. They were really sort of in the forefront of a lot of the documentary stuff that came out within the last 20 years. The owners there used to work at Rhino Records. They owned it. And then they sold it and started this company called Shout Factory. So I was there for a while, and then I started my own label when I was living in LA, a hardcore label, called No Joke Records. Put out about 6 releases on there. And then, after that one, I unfortunately started that label from about 2000. It went from about 2005 to 2000, almost 2010. It was about 5 years I ran the label. And it was just the worst time to put out music because of all the streaming, everything. Everything was so new. The old business model of music was just done. but I didn't know how to adapt, and so it failed. I mean, we did some good things, and I could talk about that later. But I regrouped, and I always still wanted to be involved, and even though lost a lot of money and I had to regroup, I did so. And now tell you, obviously, as you know, I do the podcast with Bob Nalbandian on Shockwaves Skullsessions. I was very fortunate when I was living in LA and doing the label. I met Bob.
Right, we'll get into that. I don't want to spoil everything. But
Okay, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, not even that. But there are points that I'm going that definitely we have to talk about. So let's go all the way back to New York. So how old are you during the time when you kind of were discovering your first albums, and what were they? Because I know you stated earlier that your father was a musician and whatnot, so obviously there's music going on the house. But when was a specific time where it was like, oh, like this is what music is, sort of thing?
I would have to say I always look at it this way. There's 2 points in my life. There was pre Iron Maiden and post Iron Maiden. So as a kid, just growing up, with my dad's records, classic rock, just typical Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, that stuff. And then I got into more like Kiss and Van Halen as I turned about, maybe 5 or 6 years old. And then when I discovered Iron Maiden when I was about 9 or 10 years old, that's when, like Gary Holt from Exodus says it the best. When you first hear Iron Maiden, it was like hearing music again for the first time. And that's how I felt. So when I heard Iron Maiden, man, that's when it just like kicked into gear with pure full-on metal. Like then it became almost like an obsession. So I would say that's really when it really clicked to me, like, oh, I'm so in love with not just the music, but just everything involved with heavy metal. I would go to the supermarkets and look at the magazine. Back then there was no internet, of course, in the 80s. So we'd have to just scour through the magazines and, just see what was going on, any kind of new bands, or it was such a different time. But yeah, that's when I really became so involved with metal, and it was such a mystique of it because it was so secretive. You couldn't find it. You couldn't put on the TV. You couldn't put on the radio and hear, Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. I mean, some Judas Priest songs were on the radio, but maybe 1 or 2, but you couldn't hear all that stuff back then. And
right.
So it was really, I always equated to being post and pre Iron Maiden to me. Those are the 2 sort of musical, eras I had as a kid. And so once I heard Iron Maiden, Power Slave in 1985, 86-ish area, then it took off and I just became fully hooked.
Well, okay, but you grew up in New York. What part of New York?
I grew up in Queens, New York.
So, Queens. So, okay, so what I'm getting to this is there's obviously a punk movement during those specific days. So, what was some of the scene like around that specific era that you kind of remember at an early age? Maybe even pre-Maiden, we'll say.
So pre-Maiden, I didn't know it. So, because punk and, hardcore and stuff that were huge in New York really didn't. It was huge in the early, right around the time when I was discovering Maiden is when that started becoming big. But that's when I was only like 9 years old at that point. It was not. I was born in 1975. I'm 44 years old. So I wasn't going to the clubs to see, the bands like Cro-Mags and Agnostic Front, when they were coming up in the early 80s. I got privy to them, obviously, as I got a little older. To me, when it really kicked in terms of like going to shows, going to CBGBs and all that stuff in New York it was the early 90s. So bands like Biohazard were huge. I mean, of course, yes, Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags were, but they were there was, in the 90s, there was just a different generation of, punk and hardcore that was coming in. And I was more of a, so with hardcore, there's always 2 factions of it. There's the punk side and there's the metal side. I was always more drawn to the metal side.
What about it though? But what about it kind of drew you to say the metal side as opposed to the punk side?
I think it's because maybe because of the musicianship, to me, punk, I mean, yeah, it was catchy. It was cool. I liked some of the catchy stuff, but I was always been a metalhead, ever since a kid. So I was just always drawn more to them. So when I first started hearing hardcore bands like Cro-Mags and them, I would focus or more pay attention to the heavier sides of them. To me, it all kind of fit under the same umbrella. For instance, so a good example is, when the 90s came along, metal really got more into like hardcore used to be very just punk centric. It was called hardcore punk, right, when it started, and then it became just hardcore, where that was mostly when the crossover stuff started happening, with the Gnostic Front and Karl Marx and all them, and then in the 90s, early 90s, you started having Biohazard. You started having, I'm trying to think of somebody. I mean, Agnostic Front started getting more metallic because the crossover really, that whole scene, the crossover scene when, DRI and Suicidal Tendencies, and it became more of
Gangrenes of the world. And
exactly. Yeah, good point. Exactly. Gangrene's one of them. Exactly. So, but there was also, metal started really coming into the New York hardcore scene. Really, to me, Biohazard was like the main band that really took a Sabbath sort of metal. Really, I mean, so hardcore used to definitely be. It was always very punk, and they had metal elements. But Biohazard sort of brought in this Black Sabbath thing to it as well, which is very new. So it had the groove, exactly. So, and then Madball was after that, and then Madball was one of those bands that was really what drew me, because they were a perfect, to me, blend of hardcore and metal. And so was Sabbath, Biohazard. But Biohazard also started getting more into the, in the urban thing. And that, obviously we'll get into that, if you want later, but it was really Biohazard, bands like Biohazard, Madball, and then some of the other more, like you said, groove metal bands like Prong. Prong was like, one of my favorite bands ever. They started as like a hardcore punk band, and then they became more metal. They got more groovy, same kind of thing. So it was just part of that scene in the late 80s, early 90s, where this stuff just, it sort of started to coalesce with each other. And then in New York at that point, you had Helmet, you had White Zombie, you had all these other bands, which was part of like an art rock scene, like a noise rock art rock scene. They were more like college kids that were, going to school for like, fashion design or art. So New York was just, there was so many factions, man. It was really all over the place. So you'd have so many different sounds, bands playing with each other, whether it was at CBGB's or these other clubs. It was just, there was so much stuff there at the time. It was just sort of a, amalgamation of everything, that kind of brought me into, really where I am today when it comes to, hard rock and metal.
Right. And so I guess even, so obviously there was a scene happening. And I'm just kind of curious when you started to be a part of it and started to play in bands and stuff. And I guess why, let's even just go back further than that, and why like the bass guitar? Why not drums or guitar, or, what kind of gravitated you towards the bass?
That's a great question. There's a couple, I think, reasons for that. One is I grew up with, me and my two brothers. We're pretty close in age, within 4 years, apart, the three of us. And so we all sort of picked what instrument we wanted to play when we were able to start playing music. And my younger brother, he was just natural in the drums, like my dad. I couldn't play the drums. I tried. My dad had a drum set. I just didn't have the timing. I just wasn't good. So and to me, guitar was a little more finesse. I was more of an aggressive kind of guy, just my personality. And to me, I just felt like bass was just sort of my thing. I mean, I always just loved the sound of bass. And to be honest with you, I think it was also because I thought it was probably easier, to be honest with you, which it is. I mean, it's easier to play bass than it is guitar. It's very easier to learn. So we just kind of all decided, okay, you'll do guitar, I'll do bass, and you do drums. And that's really kind of how it became about. But, at the same time, I just felt sort of a natural draw when I first picked up my uncle's bass, who played with my dad in a band. I picked it up one day and I just felt like this is my instrument, it just kind of felt right, and that's basically how I picked bass.
And I'm just kind of curious, when did you start to notice that it kind of like bass actually was kind of, to me, it's a little bit more difficult of an instrument than guitar. It's kind of a more important instrument because you're literally having to lay the foundation with the drums or whatever. So you guys are the ground level, Without a good rhythm section, the band is complete dog shit, just like a good singer. So when was that point where you started to notice, like, oh shit, like I actually got to learn how to like play better. I can't just pick up a bass and just fucking, make a bunch of noise.
I think it was more of the fact that I just didn't want to be a musician that just played like I could play a cover. Like the thing is, me and my brothers, we didn't like playing cover songs. We always just wanted to play our own shit. To us, it was like we did play covers. I mean, we obviously started that way, but it was more like we want to play our own stuff. We always had that drive to want to make our own music. Sure, it's cool playing someone else's song, but it didn't. I didn't get as excited doing that. So I could never just be in like a cover band. I had to be able to write my own stuff or create my own stuff. And so, so to me, yeah, because my dad was mostly in a cover band, and we'd ask him, "Oh, what songs do you have?" And he didn't have any songs really. They had a couple, but they couldn't almost remember it because they were so used to playing covers. I'm like, well, that's not fun, To me, music was always about creating your own things, your own stuff, your own music, your own sound, all that stuff. And I guess it was I just never had that draw to really play covers. And neither did my brothers either. We just always had this idea since we were kids in our basement, fucking around with, my dad's video camera, making fake videos, all this stuff. We just always wanted our own band and our own music. So that's kind of really why I never really, got into the covers stuff.
So let's go to your first band. So you said that you and your brothers actually formed this.
Yeah.
What was it called?
It was called Homesick. So yeah, obviously we're all from New York. They both still live in LA. We all moved out. I moved to Southern California, first. One of my brothers followed a couple years later. Then my other brother, followed a couple of years later after that. And then the reason is we were going to start, playing out and just becoming this band and do just to do our thing. And we started to the reason why it never really worked out, with how it was that by the time we really started getting things going, which was about probably, 12 years ago or so, we were really peaking pretty well. We were playing some spots down in, around the South Bay in LA. We had a bar or two, we had this one bar that was, a venue that was kind of right across the street from where my brother lived, and they knew us. So they'd let us play there all the time. It was just one of those things where I didn't see, to me, it wasn't going to, how it is, man. You got to get everybody on the same, page in terms of their level of intensity and what they want to do with the band. And it just didn't happen with my brothers. As much as I love playing with them and we had a great thing going, it was never going to be something serious. As much as I wanted it to be, or maybe they did, it just wasn't going to be that way. So I had to make a decision. Like, do I want to be a musician, or do I want to continue to do the music business stuff? And to me, it was always very natural to do the music business stuff. I always just felt like that was going to be my thing. Even back when in New York doing internships at Roadrunner and stuff, I just always knew I was going to make, I wanted to be in the music business in terms of the behind the scenes stuff, So it was one of those things. I guess maybe age had to do with it too. I was a little bit older. So when you get a little older, it was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to continue to try to make this band happen when we're not really, getting to where we want to be. I mean, we've recorded songs, we've got stuff recorded, but unless everybody's on the same page in the band in terms of doing what they, has the same, I guess, goals and this, the same, outlook on what they want to do, it's going to be hard to make happen, especially when they're your brothers, Right. So I just decided that was it. I'm old enough now. I'm just going to get hard. I'm going to go full fledged into the business and leave the playing behind. We still do it. We do it for fun now, but
Absolutely.
Not for. Yeah.
Well, let's keep going back to the band itself, and then we'll move on, obviously, to that specific point. But I'm just kind of curious, like, when was your first show, and like, what kind of, how did you kind of feel, like, even just walking onto that stage for the first time? You know what I mean? Instead of just going to shows, you're playing them.
Oh, it was. I'm sure you could speak for this too. I mean, it was definitely nerve-wracking, but it was great. It was definitely like once. You do that first show, and then obviously we had someone record it for us too, and we listened to it, we watched it, we were like, wow, this was actually, it came out pretty damn good. We got a lot of confidence from that. I loved it. So we played at this place, it was in Redondo Beach, and it was our spot. We played, a bunch of shows there. I think when I realized it was time to maybe, move on from that was, we did a show. So the guy who owned the place, he liked us. We'd done some cover stuff in there, and he was like, I want you guys to play our anniversary. They do every year they do an anniversary show, and I guess a lot of guys in the bar, in the bar liked us. They were like, oh, these guys are pretty good. They play some good covers of like, some older stuff. But our whole thing was we wanted to play our own songs. So that day, we got called up and said, hey guys, you want to play this anniversary show? We're like, sure. But like in our heads, we're like, this time we're going to go and we're going to play our own shit. And we did. We mixed it up. We had some covers. We played our own stuff. And I think what it was that we realized that, obviously it didn't go as well as it did when we were just playing the covers at this place. Some people probably like, well, these guys, because we were a heavier band. We'd play some covers, but then when we did our own stuff, it was definitely louder and heavier. And I think it might have turned some people off. This was about, like I said, this is about 12 years ago or so. So at that point, I don't think, our style of music was really connecting just to generic, fans in the audience. So I think the owner wasn't so happy that we decided to interject our own music into the set list. And we just realized, at least I did, was like, okay, it's a different time and age right now, right? It's how it is, man. It's not easy to just go to a place, play, and attract listeners. No one really goes to, when they go to watch, live music, they usually want to see a particular band or whatever in particular. They're not really looking to see and listen to anyone else or any cover, bands that are opening. People just want to go see their friend's band or see whatever band and then leave, So it was like, I knew it was going to be a lot of grunt work to really do what we wanted to do. And I don't think everybody in the band, with my brothers, I don't think everybody was ready to do it, or was actually dedicated to do it. So once I saw that the dedication thing wasn't there, I was like, okay, it's time for me to get back into the music business where I was, beforehand when I did the label.
Oh, okay. So this is way later. So even earlier in like the 90s, you weren't playing in any bands or anything like that? Or like your first show was literally in like 2008, 2007 era?
No, it was around. It was before that, but that was when we kind of stopped.
Gotcha.
It was in the earlier 2000s. We had done stuff back in New York, but we were all over the place back there. Like, I had moved, out to California in 1998. So I was away from my brothers at that point. It was when they moved out in 2003 is when we started getting things rolling again. Because my whole thing was I wanted to come out here and do it, and then they wanted, eventually wanted to do the same thing. But back in New York was different. I moved out here when I was 22 years old in California. So I was just, scratching the surface of learning how to really play bass guitar pretty well at that point. I was really just starting to get, better at it. I wasn't really good when I was a teenager. I didn't really take it seriously. I didn't really start taking it serious until, my brothers kind of moved out here, and then we was like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going full force. So that was, around 2003 or 4 is when we really started playing shows. But 2008 was when we kind of were like, okay, what are we doing from here? And, it wasn't really serious after that. We also saw how the business was at the time. It was just a different time. And, we just do it for fun, like I said now. But, yeah, we weren't doing this in the 90s in New York yet. It was really when we all of us moved out to L.A.
Gotcha. Yeah, and you're right about the business being, changing rapidly. Because, 2008 was an entirely different scene, which is so sad to know that was only 12 years ago,
Yeah, I know.
Now let's go back to where like your first recordings, because you mentioned that you had done some recordings. I'm just kind of curious what your first time experience in a recording studio was for you.
Sure. Well, we used to record all over LA. I mean, Uncle Studios, which I believe I heard is closed now. I mean, it's a great place up in the valley, up in Van Nuys. They recorded, bands like Yes recorded albums there. I mean, they have this old soundboard there. It's awesome. That was one of the first places we would jam and record. And we also went to the old the one that Dave Grohl owns.
Oh, Sound City.
Yes, Sound City. Yeah. So we used to before he bought that out, we used to go and rehearse there all the time and record there. Those were our main two. We've also recorded, a couple of studios down in Lawndale, one in, Culver City. We really just kind of messed around all of Southern California, at least between Orange County and LA, but so the first time we recorded was down in LA. It was in Sound City. We recorded, it came out great. I mean, between Uncle Studios and Sound City, both of those in Van Nuys, those places are great. I mean, if you were just an upcoming band looking to record, it was cheap. The quality was good. Like I said, they had the soundboards, those old soundboards, both of them did. So yeah, I mean, that's what really got us wanting to keep, to continue what we were doing, was just because those experiences was so, they were so fun. We thought the sound came out great. So yeah, I mean, it's just, LA obviously just is, they got so much stuff there. I mean, so many studios. I mean, it's amazing what they got in LA. It's such a music, rock and roll city. It's unbelievable there.
When did not even when? What do you prefer when you record? Because obviously we probably have done both experiences where we recorded as a band and then or we record individually with a click. So in your opinion, and what do you prefer when you go into a studio, especially back then?
You mean in terms of like playing together, like live, or you mean just doing
it like by yourself? Do you prefer having the live band per se with like, no click kind of thing? So if you fuck up, it's like kind of left in there, or do you prefer it to go and kind of track it one by one and then get the best possible, I guess tracks that way?
Sure. No, it's a good question. We've done it both ways. I think when we recorded, we did better when we did it live. Yeah, with no clicks, no clicks. That's I think how it just the recordings we do have, they came out better when we did it that way than when we did it, tracking everything separately. From my experiences, yeah, we because I mean I guess it's just the way we would do like 10 takes, whatever it took. Live takes, and then when we would know when we hit it. You know what I mean? It was just like, okay, we did like usually it would take sometimes anywhere between a good 8 to 10 takes. We'd usually take one of them, but sometimes it would take us 15 or 20. I mean, whatever it was, I prefer it live though. Yeah, we preferred it doing it definitely live instead of doing it separate. I think it just came out more. It sounded better. It sounded more organic. It sounded more natural. Where the others, we did it the other way. We did it both ways, but we preferred it live for sure.
And were you guys, I don't know if you mentioned this, and my apologies if you did, were you guys kind of like a faster kind of band, or like just like a pure heavy kind of band, or punk band, or like what kind of, because obviously you mentioned you like playing, as a band, so the songs are probably not as intricate, so to speak, you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, first of all, it's just we were a trio, right? And so in terms of musical tastes, I'm a metalhead. I like things faster, more aggressive. My brother who plays drums, my brother Brian, he is it's interesting. He has so many different, diverse tastes, but when he plays, man, yeah, he's a hard hitter. So that's why I always thought we formed a great a great rhythm section because we were always on the same page. And then my brother who played guitar, he wasn't really, he loved metal, he loved hard rock and stuff, but when it came to his playing, it wasn't really that type. So it wound up being mostly my bass that was doing most of the rhythm, parts, in terms of, and I tried to fuzz it and crunch it up to make it almost sound like it was more of a rhythm guitar. But our sound was more like, I'm trying to really explain it, it was a little bit all over the place. It was mostly driving rock and roll. I guess that's how I could say it. I'm definitely more of a metalhead. Like I said, my brothers aren't really metalheads. They like metal, but they're not metalheads. And so it was more of like a driving rock kind of thing. I'm trying to think of a band who I can compare it to, but I guess maybe it's sort of like a stoner rock kind of band, like a Fu Manchu or something like that. Not as fuzzy or not that kind of, those kind of vocals, but just that kind of, I guess, pace, more mid-tempo, kind of stuff. Not super fast. We definitely had a couple of songs that were more punky and more hardcore tinged, but maybe like 2 or 3 of them. But other than that, just sort of straight up, driving like hard rock.
Gotcha. And were you singing back then, or was one of your brothers singing?
I sang a few songs, but I wouldn't say I necessarily, quote unquote sang. It was more like I don't want to say talked, but you know how it is. It's not really. I don't have a great voice. My brother's, he was mostly sang the songs. He has a pretty decent voice. He has a good voice. Me, I didn't have a good voice, but I did sing some tunes, but more along the lines of hardcore type of, almost kind of talking, or you're not really singing. You know what I mean? It's hard to really explain, but I'm trying to compare it to like, I don't know if you ever heard of the band Carmen to Burn. I don't know if you ever heard of those guys. Old stoner rock band. If you listen to their first, album, it was sort of along the lines of that. I would do a part where it's sort of like, it's like when Phil Anselmo, when he sings, or he does his like, deep, like, he does that kind of stuff. I would do that. And then my brother would kind of come in and sing. We sort of had like a tag team approach on certain songs. So we kind of switched it up, you know what I mean? But mostly my brother, who was the drummer, that was the other problem too. He was a drummer, yet he was the best singer in the band. So that's a problem right there, right? So yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
So let's move forward just a bit. the 90s for you, right? Because so you were obviously in your late teens or early teens to like your, I guess, early 20s. What were you kind of doing in terms of like the behind the scenes sort of stuff?
Okay, yeah. So my first behind the scenes, if you want to call it that, gig was at ASCAP. There was a friend of a friend who he was like, "Hey, we've got." So back in the late '90s or mid '90s, there was a record label in New York, a metal label called Mayhem Records, and I think they put out the band Propane put a record out on them. It was a small label that was sort of fledgling label. And I had a connection through them, like a friend of a friend, and my friend was like, "Oh yeah, my buddy who works there says they're hiring some people to work at this place he's working at called Mayhem Records." And I was like, "Oh man, I just got a new job too." I was like, I think I was like 19. I'm like, "Oh man, it sounds cool though. I just got this job." So it stewed with me for like a week, and I finally was like, I have to do it. Like I want to work in this, So I hit up my buddy. He's like, "Oh yeah, he's gonna be at this show tonight." I think it was like No Effects or something, not a band I like, but I was like, whatever, wherever he's at, I'm gonna go. I want to work for that label. So I went there and I met him, and I said, "Dude, hey, I heard you guys are hiring. I want to, get a job." And he said, "You know what, man? They just stopped hiring." I'm like, "Fuck, like, fuck, I blew it. I knew I should have said yes the week before." So he's sitting next to this lady who's just like, "Well, hey, I work for ASCAP. I'm actually looking for an intern if you want to work with me." I was like, "All right, well, I'll look into it." I didn't know what ASCAP was at the time, so I looked into it. I said, "Okay, so I checked it out. I'll do it." So I interned there. That was my first, gig in the music business, quote unquote music business. I did that for a little while, but I wasn't working with the bands. I wanted to work in the actual at a record company. I mean, ASCAP was cool. It was cool, but it was like, you're working in an office, So, which was
well, what were some of the things you were doing, and not to cut you off, but what were some of the things you were doing at ASCAP? Like especially on the computer stuff.
Yeah, it was more secretarial stuff is what you did, And one thing I learned right away is that people from that job is people in the music business are assholes. They really are. And the guys I was, I think one time I maybe misdirected a call. I was working for free. I wasn't getting paid for this. And the guy just like went off on me. I'm like, "Holy shit, dude! I made a mistake. I'm brand new. It was like my first or second day." And I realized right from there, this is definitely a cutthroat business, though. It's definitely not a business to get into if you're a weak person, man. You have to you got to be thick-skinned. But I just didn't like, working it because it wasn't working with bands. You were doing more, just typical, office, just sort of administrative type of stuff, which was cool. But it was like I wanted to work with the band. So anyway, after that, I interviewed. I met someone else who knew someone who was working at Warner Brothers. And so they're like, "Oh, they, looking for interns and like to hire two." I'm like, "Great, man." So I interviewed, and like an idiot, at that time, like I said, I was 19, 20 years old, and I was raised thinking that major labels are, they're evil, they're so bad, to all these independent bands. So when I went for the interview, this guy was asking me, "Well, what do you know about, major record labels?" And I basically just like talked shit about them. Like, I mean, it was one of those things where I was just like, major labels suck and it's all about independence. Major labels don't support the bands. And needless to say, I didn't get the gig. Obviously, you talk like that about a major label when you're going to work for one, it's not going to happen. So, I learned quickly just to keep your mouth shut and just keep moving on. So anyway, I wound up, once again, I got lucky. I had a connection to Roadrunner Records. And there was some girl that my buddy knew that was interning there. And they were like, "Oh, they needed more interns and people to work there." So I did that. And like I said, that's where, it really, when I worked at Roadrunner, because obviously I was a fan of so many bands on Roadrunner, that was like a dream because I'm working, I'd see some of the band members come into the office. I would, fill on the phones during the secretary's lunch break. And then I'd pick up the phone and it's like, "Oh, this is Dino from Fear Factory. Can I speak to Monty Connor?" Monty Connor's working there, the ultimate, I mean, I wanted to be an A&R guy. That's the idol. If anybody wanted to be a metal A&R guy in the 90s, I mean, Monty Connor was the guy you wanted to be, and
or Brian Slagle,
yeah,
something like that.
Or Slagle, yeah. So basically Monty Connor was the East Coast Brian Slagle, exactly. Slagle was out here, so I at the time I had no access to him, but yeah. So I mean, and then that was it, man. So that's what I did behind the scenes. I worked at those two places before I came to California later on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, what was different, I guess, with Roadrunner as opposed to, say, ASCAP, besides working with bands? Was there anything else that, like, you kind of picked up on?
Yeah, I mean the whole thing was different. Like I said, ASCAP was really it was basically just working like an office job. I mean, there wasn't musicians in there. It's such a different. It's part of the whole, of course, music business umbrella, but working at ASCAP, it's more collecting royalties, right? It's just such a you're not promoting music. I always wanted to be there to promote bands and to help them, achieve their goals. That was always my passion. ASCAP, you're not promoting any bands or goals. You're just basically taking phone calls. You're entering data. It's just very mundane stuff. You don't really feel like you're working in the music business when you're working at ASCAP.
Interesting. So the whole environment was completely different. That's awesome. Okay.
Oh, big time. Yeah, big time. Mm-hmm.
Now, what is your next step? I guess just after being an intern, when did you actually get a full-fledged position at Roadrunner?
No, I mean that was my dream, but no, of course I realized when I was there for about 4 or 5 months, I realized, okay, in order to get in this, I mean, I did everything I could to try to get noticed and try to get hired, but there's only so many jobs, right? So, you have to. That's the thing about the music business, which is why eventually I decided to take myself out of trying to work at record labels, is because you got so many other people doing or wanting to do what you want to do. So it's really cutthroat. So for instance, like I interned for, a couple of guys at Roadrunner who were they worked in product management. And one of the guys I worked for, I could tell because I was such a go-getter, man. I was so passionate about work and wanting to work for them. They give me something to do and I get it done so fast because I was just trying to prove myself. And yet, what happens is in the music business is that everyone's doing the same thing. So people fear, they fear basically for their jobs. So if you're an intern that comes in and you're kicking butt and you have good ideas and you get along with people there and stuff, you're a threat to them. You're a total threat. They do not want to help you out. So what happened was the guy I was working for, when I was starting to sort of make a name, if you want to call it that, but when I was starting to get to know people and people were starting to like me and know me, that was a threat to him because they could just say like, hey, you know what? They could just fire you on the spot and say, this guy's going to take your job. They could do that at record labels. So after that, he stopped helping me. He stopped, letting me do anything because I think he saw me as this guy who was a threat. I knew my shit and I was passionate about it. And it was like, well, I don't want this guy taking my job. And so they stopped. So a lot of times when you do internships, they don't really show you the ropes. You're just there doing grunt stuff, that they don't want to pay people to do, just sending out mailers and sending out, making calls to, tattoo shops just to promote stuff or to let them know you're sending them packages. They don't want to do that stuff. So that's what they basically hire, interns for. But if you're someone good at it and if they notice that, there's a lot of people that aren't going to like you because you're a threat to them. And that's the music business, man. In a nutshell, when you're working at a record label, that's what it's all about. So I learned quickly there, like, okay, I don't think I'm going to get hired here. So, and at that point, man, I was ready to move out of New York anyway and get to California. Because to me, when I visited LA, that's where it was all at anyway. As much as New York's great for it too, don't get me wrong. To me, LA was, that's where really the music business was at. So, I just took off and said, okay, I just chalked it up. I got, the experience out of it. It was cool. But, and then I came to LA and then that's when I came to Southern California is when things started, working better for me. Yeah. I finally got a job, a full-time job working for, the label Shout Factory, which is still going strong today. Once again, though, it wasn't really a record label. They put out documentaries, they put out anthologies. It was, these guys were smart, man. They were just ahead of the game. They knew at that point, this was 2003. They just knew that the whole music business was collapsing. The whole business model, the way they sold records was collapsing. So these guys were smart, man. They sold Rhino Records, and then they got into the DVD business, the documentary business, which, they've been doing great ever since. So, yeah, that was my first real, paying job and stuff in the music business.
Interesting. Now, when was the first time that you actually came out to LA, maybe just to visit a friend or something? Because did you actually have family out here per se?
No, I did. I just came out to visit one time with my friend. I loved it. And then this was 97. And then in 98, I wanted to do the same thing. And this time I came out to San Diego. I visited more so than LA. And, just as a kid who was 22 at the time, I fell in love with it. And I was like, this is where I'm moving. I'm going to move to San Diego. I mean, I knew there wasn't really much of a music scene there, but it was a great place to start just to get my feet wet. I went back to school, that whole thing. I figured if I got my college degree, I'll have a better chance when I move up to LA. to get a job. And, I was focused on what I could have on my resume that was going to stand out, someone would hire me over, my competitor or whatever you want to call it. And, San Diego was a good place just to kind of hang back, get used to California, nice beach town. Party. It was a nice place to party. But yeah, after living there a few years is when I moved to LA. But yeah, when I first came to LA, it was just, I wanted to, just to visit. That was my drive to want to move to California. I just knew, I just felt it in the air, man. The music at that point, even, places like the Rainbow were still, going off with which is great, bands even playing there in the parking lot and stuff. It was just, it was a place, LA at that time, the Sunset Strip, even though it was past its heyday, it still had a really cool scene going on in the late 90s. And I was like, yeah, man, this is, I want to be out there, man. I'm out of New York. New York's a great place for music, but it wasn't really a great place for metal and hard rock. It was more of a punk rock place. It was more at that point rap and all the urban music and stuff, and I wanted to get out. I was all into metal and hard rock. So to me, LA was the place, man. It really was.
How did you come to even know who kind of Shout Factory was? Like, where did that connection take place for you?
Yeah, another good question. But, so what I did was when I moved to LA, you have to network, right? Because everybody and their mother wants to be in the music business. So there was this thing called the LA Music Connection. And it was, it wasn't really the greatest, basically what you would do is you pay a fee every year. And they would hook you up with all the job listings that, in the business. And they would also have like once a month, they'd have like a networking sort of luncheon thing or whatever something like just sort of a meetup at like a hotel. And then, it was this lady who ran it. It was a cool thing she did. She was basically just getting, everybody in LA who wanted to be in the business to sort of network. But what happened was, just like typical LA in general, you have actors that were seeping into the scene. It's just like, well, dude, we're not acting. This is all music business stuff. But like people are coming up to you going, oh man, you have a record label? Cool. I'm an actor. If you ever need, me to help you out one day, it's like, well, what the hell are you going to help me out with, man? Like, it's stupid, So anyway, it was called the LA Music Connection. There was this lady, I think her name was Tess Taylor, and she ran it, and it was cool. She had a website, and so she would have all these job listings from all labels and stuff. And I applied for probably like 50 of them, until I actually finally got a job, because everybody who came here across, throughout the whole globe, who wanted to work in the music business was a part of this thing. So it was hard to sort of stick out. And that's why I did the whole college thing and went and got my degree and stuff. It was really just so I could stand out and have something a little bit maybe extra that someone else didn't have, because it was very competitive industry, man, real competitive. Even just working as an assistant, marketing assistant or something, extremely competitive. So yeah, I saw the listing on there, I applied, and I finally got, hired as a job.
Absolutely. Well, let's go back to your degree. So what is your degree actually in?
I have a couple of degrees, man. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in business and a concentration in marketing. But the thing about that, is when I got those degrees, it wasn't, it was sort of I would say pre-e-commerce, but it was like at the beginning of it. So it's like now the degree the kids, people will get now is so, in the same field is so different because of technology. So my degree was fine, but the bottom line is it really has nothing to do with, when it comes to the music business, man, degree don't mean shit. You know what I mean? It really doesn't mean anything. It really depends on who you know, what you know, how hungry you are. It's all about the connections, man. You know what I mean? So it helped me in terms of getting maybe in a marketing assistant job, but in terms of me really, getting to where I wanted to be, it didn't really mean nothing. You know what I mean? It really had nothing to do with anything. It was just a little kind of extra thing you could put on your resume, and that's it.
Gotcha. So what were some of the things you were doing at Shout Factory that were different from, I guess, Roadrunner?
Well, Roadrunner, I was just an intern, you know what I mean? So I was just sort of, Roadrunner was cool, man. I mean, I was able to, I got to say, man, they gave me a few chances to kind of be on, I was in on some meetings they had. I was able to make help make like an ad for Obituary, like their live record one time. I mean, the guy who I worked with, he was cool in the beginning. He kind of let me in on some things. It wasn't just until, the end where I was really getting hungry. And I think he sensed it, where he was just like, I'm not going to give this guy any more, exposure to things, because he didn't want me to take his job, And not that I'm saying I would have. It's just that's just how that industry works. I had no idea at the time. But in terms of Shout Factory, I worked directly with, the head marketing person there. It was such a great place, man. It was so professional in there. Like the difference between working at, like I interned at Roadrunner. I also interned as well at, just for a little bit, at Century Media and Nuclear Blast. When Nuclear Blast first came to the U.S., they shared the same building with Century Media in Hawthorne down there in L.A. And I same thing. I applied for a job there as a publicist for Nuclear Blast. I didn't get it. I shouldn't have got it. I just didn't know enough really at that time about a lot of the Nuclear Blast bands because they were still kind of new in the U.S. Coming from Germany. But one thing I learned there, it's just that when you worked at these metal labels, it was really tough because you just had so many kids like yourself that wanted to break in and just were so involved in the scene, where when I worked at Shout Factory, it was more of a business, so they saw my degree and they knew I had some marketing skills, and that went a long way in a company like that because they're not necessarily really a record label. They're in the music business. They put out short anthologies and stuff, but they put out, DVD. They were all over the place. They were more of an entertainment company, I would say, more than an actual record label. So it was, things were a lot different there. It was more just like a regular company, selling any kind of product. And but it was like I said, it was a great time, great place to work. I would have loved to have stayed there and continued to rise up there, but what happens too in the music business is, when you want to make it, you have to do the shit job for a while until you earn your stripes. And I knew my job after my marketing assistant job was going to be in sales. I just didn't want to do sales. Sales is just not my thing. And so when I realized it was about that was when I realized, okay, you know what, I'm going to have to maybe start thinking of doing something else because that's just the way it went.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what was the next step, I guess, after just did you quit Shout Factory or get let go or something? Like, what was the next step for you in terms of your life back in those specific times?
Sure. Yeah, no, I left. And it was tough, man. I didn't want to leave. But I just knew, like, what I decided at that point too was this. I always wanted to open up my own record label. I was lucky enough at the time. I was working at a college, and like I said, I was going to school for free. I was doing all that stuff. But one thing I realized was like, well, I could take out student loans here. I'm not paying for college. It's tuition free. So I decided, I'm going to take out some student loans here. I'm going to start my own record label. I never had access to thousands of dollars to, start a label. I mean, who has that, right? Not many people do. So I had this option where I could take out these loans because my school was free and the government doesn't know that, that the school's paying my, my tuition. And so I was able to take out, thousands of dollars on a student loan to start up a record label. So I just decided at that point I was done trying to go from record label to record label. I had been, before I worked at Shout Factory, there was another label that it was a defunct label after about a half a year that I worked at it, but it was more of like a R&B label. It wasn't my type of music, but I just realized I didn't want to keep going through this process of working at this label and going here. And it was getting, it was kind of getting tiring after a while. And it was just like, is this really going to happen for me? So I decided, you know what, fuck it. I'm going to go ahead and just start my own label.
You wanted to be your own boss, not be somebody else, have somebody else be your boss. So I totally get it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't really so much that. It was just that I didn't see how I was going to really, unless I knew people, just like anything in the entertainment industry, man, it's all about who you know. And I didn't know a ton of people in LA. I wasn't from there. So I had met some people, sure, along the way while I was doing, working, but not enough to where I felt comfortable where I was going to be able to, eventually break in. And mind you, too, at this time, this was about 2000, 2001, 2002, where the whole music industry was collapsing, but due to, the streaming and stuff, due to technology. So, I was kind of going the route I had in my mind the way it was the old way. This was a whole new transformation now. So everybody was getting laid off. Nobody was hiring anymore. Everyone was downsizing. So I saw the writing on the wall and I realized, well, if I'm going to do anything, it's going to have to be on my own because, there's going to be no more marketing stuff soon. And it really isn't. There's no marketing assistance now. Everything's just more, if you're working online and stuff, there's the jobs and the whole, the way the industry was running at that time, the late 90s and stuff was done. It was going through this transformation period in the 2000s and really nobody knew what was going on. You know what I mean? It was it took a while for record companies and just people in general to figure out, okay, how do we make money in this business now with technology here? And it's not going to go away, So it was the worst timing. If you wanted to be in a music business, man, that was the worst timing to be in the mid 2000s. And unfortunately, that's when I was there in the early to mid 2000s,
Let's go back to you just starting the label and obviously having the funds to do it. What is the first initial step that you take?
Well, what it was is I was very hesitant to do it, obviously, because I knew it was a big, we're not just talking, we're talking thousands of dollars, right, that you're going to be in debt to. So I waited a little while. I really wanted to not just jump into it, but it really started when Dimebag, Dimebag got shot and killed. To me, that was just like, that's it, fuck it. I'm going to do this. For some reason, it's just something that happened. When I read that he died and he got killed, and I was just like, man, I have to, like, that's it. Fuck it. I'm just going to start this label. I have the means to do it. I have a way to do it. I'm going to do it. That's what really kind of triggered me and gave me the impetus to do it, man. It's just because I'm just so passionate about it. And when he got killed, it was, to me, I took it as a sign, just go ahead and do it. And so what I decided to do was, pulling the trigger on your first band was a little tough because, not that you have to wait for the perfect band, but you want to wait to definitely you hear something, that you're going to have no problem putting thousands of dollars behind. So what I did was I decided to just sort of throw it out there on some, message boards and stuff that I was looking, to sign bands. And so I already had a name I wanted to, call it. Like, it was called No Joke Records. I had an idea ready for years. Me and my buddy from New York, we had talked about doing something like this for years. And so I just decided, man, this is it. This is time to do it. And yeah, I just started putting stuff out there. I put out like an ad or two. Just saying like, hey, I'm, blah, 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 Matt from whatever. I'm looking for, label. Back then it was like these sites where you can go to and do this kind of stuff and bands would look at and when they were looking to, for some sort of support for their music. And, so next thing you know, I started getting, demos sent to me left and right in the mail. And, when it started, when I finally signed a band sent me the CD. They were called Noose. It's spelled N-U-S-C. They're from New Jersey. They've been around for a long time, man. Great, like, crossover kind of thrash band. And they sent me a disc, and it had the worst album cover, man, you can ever imagine. I laughed when I saw it. I'm like, oh, God, look at this fucking thing, man. So as a joke, I'm like, well, I got to hear what this sounds like. And I was getting ready to laugh, and the next thing you know, music comes on, man. It was fucking great. And I'm like, what? I'm like, wow, these guys are fucking, this is awesome. But this is the worst album cover I've ever seen in my life. And so I just decided, I say, you know what? It's probably a good idea if I sign a band that's already got a record. I'll just maybe, manufacture it. I'll just produce a lot of, I'll produce it. I'll market it. This way, we're not paying for the production costs. We're not paying for the recording. It's already done. It's a good first, just to get your feet wet. It was a good first record to do. So that's when I decided I'm going to do it. When I heard that record, we just changed the cover. And then, we just pressed it up and, it did okay, but that was the beginning of it. That was about 2005 when it started.
Now, what were some of the deals you were kind of doing back in those times? Because, you got to, like I said, the CDs were probably the top of the line.
Sure.
Obviously they're on the decline because of the lime wires and, people obviously pirating music back in the day. It was way before streaming. And I'm just kind of curious, like, where you put your funds into as far as a physical product goes and, some of the deals that you were actually doing back in the first stages of No Joke.
Well, yeah. So that band Noose that I signed, what we did with them was strictly just basically I manufactured the CDs and I marketed them. So the deal in terms of like what I did was I basically sent them an X number amount of CDs. That was their payment, because at that point it wasn't like, they didn't tour that much for one. So I knew I wasn't going to make, I didn't want to start off obviously basically, paying for recording costs and all that stuff. You know what I mean? So my first deal, I wanted to make it as simple as possible. So it was like, look, you already have this album made. We're just going to basically, manufacture. I think we did about 2,000 CDs. We did a deal where I was going to, obviously promote, so much in terms of, ads in magazines at that point, as well as just sending, CDs and stuff to all the, review sites, across the globe. So that was sort of the deal was more, I just gave them a certain amount of CDs, that they could sell to their show. They could sell them $10 a pop, you know what I mean? And that's what kind of a lot of, I think, labels, independent labels do even probably till today. That was basically the best deal to do in terms of not having to get too deep into the whole monetary exchange, thing, so one thing I hate about business, is the money part, unfortunately is the exchange of money. So basically I gave them, a certain amount of CDs. I think it was a couple hundred CDs or whatever it was that they could sell at $10 a pop. You figure you give someone 300 CDs, they could sell $10. It's $3,000 for a record that's been out for a couple of years that they already put out, and that was kind of our deal. That was the first deal I did. Going further, I did some different type of deals after that, but yeah, that was the first deal we did. Was that yeah?
So like a licensing kind of deal, so that you were just starting off.
Yes, that was a licensing.
Gotcha.
Yes. Yeah. That first record was a licensing deal. Absolutely, yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, when was like the next step after Noose and just
Sure.
working with them, and what did that initial experience kind of teach you on how to do things differently or whatever?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, it didn't teach me much, but what it did teach me is I did realize I didn't want to. They had a manager, that band News, nice guy, but to me, he didn't really know what the hell he was doing, and it made me realize I don't want to really. If I could work directly with the bands themselves, I prefer that. And that's exactly what I, instead of having them having a manager or dealing with some kind of management. So what I did with the second release, I signed a band who's actually doing really well right now. They're called Count Time. They're a hardcore band out of LA. They just toured with Agnostic Front. And they were on the Persistence tour in Europe over the winter, this past winter. They were just on a TV show. It's amazing that they're doing phenomenal now. Back then they were just starting up, and so I realized I wanted to start from the ground up back then. I said, you know what, I don't want to. I want to sign a new band. I don't want to sign a band that's been around for a long time because they already they've been involved in the business. They already have what they want. And it's not something I can really give them. My whole idea with No Joke Records was I used to call it, I wanted it to be a stepping stone label. So basically, I'm going to be the guy who signs you. I'm going to put out a good quality CD. I mean, all my CDs were Digipack, except for the first one, News, because it was already out already. So, but all the bands I had signed personally, I did Digipacks for. I put out a nice, a good product for them, so that when they'd go out and play their shows, they could sell these CDs, and then in hopes of them getting signed by a bigger label. Because I was a one-man operation, I could only do so much. And so with them, that's what we did. They were just a real brand new band. They had a demo. I heard it. We got together. We worked it out. We got along. We were friends. I sort of co-managed them in a way. I was very involved with them. And to me, that was good. But I also put a lot of money into them because they were my friends. That's another thing you learn later, not after this one, is maybe don't sign your friends. Not necessarily the best thing to do, but I never regretted it, man. It was a really cool experience. But I signed them to a different type of deal. That was definitely based more off of, I paid for their recording. I based their, what they got paid more off of their album sales. Obviously, it was streaming at the time too, with iTunes and everything, all the MP3s. And it worked really good, man. The first record they did was great. Good buzz. They toured, and that was the thing too. I wanted to sign a band that toured. That's what I learned from the first record, from the first band, Nooses. They didn't tour. They were older. They had families. They played local shows in the East Coast, and that was it. I wanted to have a band that was going to tour because obviously that's where you're going to make some of your money back, at least. Not necessarily make money, but you could break even as long as the bands are touring, and Count Time was great, man. They toured and we had a great relationship. So yeah, we had a good deal with them for the second record. And that was probably when the label really started doing really well. And I started having a better vision of what I wanted with the record label.
Gotcha. Now how long did this label actually like exist for? Kind of thing.
About 5 years, 2005 to almost 2010 to late 2009.
Okay. Okay. So obviously some of the most of the bands you were probably signing a lot of them were speed metal, because I remember speed metal was huge then and metalcore was huge then. So maybe you kind of were signing some of those style bands.
Yeah, well, Count Time was a hardcore band. They had a little bit of the metalcore tinge, just very little, but they were mostly sort of. New York sort of old school, like not say old school, but they were more the modern. They had some urban influences in them, but they were just a typical like sort of Madball, Agnostic Front side, sort of sounding band. After them, yes, it was different. I mean, I signed, hardcore was a good genre to really, when you're starting a label, it was a really good genre to get yourself started in, because it's very DIY, it's very low key. Bands, I mean, everyone appreciates, if you putting out any records by them, it's very appreciative. People are very tight knit there, and they really help each other out. But I always wanted to have a metal label. I wanted more of the metal, sound of the bands that I signed. But I understood that metal's a tricky, genre because there's so many, genres and subgenres of it. It's also very organized. Hardcore is not as organized. You know what I mean? So a guy like me, just a one man kind of thing coming in there, could totally do a good job when you're in the hardcore scene. If I just decide to start signing a bunch of metal bands, it's a little bit more difficult because it's just a wider audience. So I always thought, to me, hardcore was a good place to start. Plus I kind of knew a lot about it just from growing up with the New York hardcore stuff. So, but yeah, as I got to my third, record, I really wanted to start getting more involved with metal. So I signed a band. Well, there was a metal band out of New York called Neglect, very metalcore type of sound back in the 90s. And the guitarist from that band, who was very active, he's very big in Germany. He had a couple of bands. I signed one of his bands. Was a bad record. It was definitely the record I regret most on the label, just because it sounded like shit. The production was terrible. But right after that, he had another band that I signed as well, and that was a lot better. It was more of like a Sepultura kind of sound. You know what I mean? So, it wasn't necessarily speed metal that I was signing, but it's very fast stuff. That was to me, the mid 2000s was a very interesting time with metal, because there was so much going on. There wasn't, and with all the technology, there was no real core scene. You know what I mean? It was like, it was, metal bands were mixed with hardcore bands. And, it was just, it was really a weird time, man. I started that label, man, and probably the worst time you could ever do it. It was when CDs were not being sold. I mean, no one was buying CDs anymore. It was just going through such a transformation. It was just a bad time. It was a tough time, which is why the label didn't, obviously survive.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
But to go off your point too, not to like counter argument it, but there was a huge thrash scene happening that was like kind of like a throwback. So you had some throwback scenes that were kind of huge in that specific pocket. So not all of the mid 2000s was a total waste.
Oh no, it wasn't a waste. I maybe I said that wrong, man. It was just difficult. Like you said, no, you're right. There was the thrash scene was coming back, right? With the Warbringer, Warbringer was around, Evil, all those bands. Bono by Blondes, yep, exactly. But there was more of the metalcore stuff. Like you remember the label
Victory?
What the hell is it? Not Victory. It was in LA.
Sumerian?
God, it's gonna kill me. Not Sumerian, but the same sort of God, it's gonna kill me, man. It was right up in the valley there. It helped me, but it was similar label to Sumerian.
Okay.
It was Sumerian. Yeah, God, it'll hit me in a second, man. It's gonna take a second. I haven't
after the interview
thought of the label in a while. Yeah, hopefully not, but I know. But no, you're right. There was stuff going on, man. I think a lot of it too was me not realizing that was going on too. You know what I mean? I think I just had made up my mind. Okay, this is what's going on right here, and I'm going to go with this. And I didn't really see, all that thrash coming up. I didn't see it. It totally, went past me. I think too with me, I was also looking for always, in metal, it was like when you were in the business, you were always looking for something that was new. Not necessarily something that was like, oh, here's a new wave of, say, thrash, with Warbringer and those bands. I wasn't looking for anything sort of, a new wave of something. I was looking for something that was new and unique. And I think that's what I mean by there wasn't, much new. It was more like there wasn't anything unique. By that time, a lot of the metalcore, the Shadows Fall and all those bands, I liked a lot of those bands. But it was that was sort of dying out. It was like, okay, that was starting to get worn out. You could sense there was something else kind of percolating. And what was percolating was a lot of that, stoner rock stuff. But same thing, I didn't know that was going on either. I was so hooked into the metal and into, the traditional metal and into the hardcore, where I probably just overlooked that there was scenes like that going on in the area at the time. Right. I definitely did. Yeah.
And we can't neglect this too. When Guitar Hero was coming out too, that fucking showcased a whole shitload of old school bands. So that's probably why you had some more of old school scenes happening that were new bands doing old school style stuff, because you had video games were hugely prevalent, and I don't think I've ever brought that up too, but it's like it's that aspect. It often kind of gets neglected as well, with the video games and the movies coming out, having old school kind of bands on those specific platforms. So just want to throw that out there as all.
No, great point, man. Absolutely, you're dead on with that. Absolutely.
Now let's go to 2010. So,
sorry, quickly. Media Scare. That's the label.
Okay.
Just hit me. Yeah.
See, you didn't have to wait till the end of the
See?
interview. I loved it.
I knew I'd get it. It's on the tip of my tongue, man. But yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So, like the end of your run with No Joke or whatever, when was the point where you decided, man, this isn't for me anymore, sort of thing?
Well, it wasn't so much it wasn't for me. It was I was broke. I'll be honest with you. It was also at the point too where I'll be honest with you. It's business and art, right? There's such separate things, man. And I never took this out on the artists themselves. The bands I work for. I got along with all of them. But to me, I realized that it was, like I said, the main thing was that at the time that the whole business model had changed, and I really didn't know where it was going. I was still kind of going on the old business model. I was still going on, the CD sales, and I wasn't even, even though I knew, streaming and stuff were starting to really take hold. I really didn't know much about it. I was so still stuck on the old way that things were run. You know what I mean? And so even though I was learning about it as I was going, I like I said, I was a one-man operation at that time, and so it was really just me. And I didn't really know, I think it was, I just knew I was losing a lot of money, man. I wasn't, the bands, even though they were doing good, they were touring. Some of them were doing really good. A couple of them did really well and still are. But the CDs weren't selling. So I wasn't really looking to make money. I just wanted to at least get my money back. I just wanted to break even. That was my whole goal all along. But if you're not even coming close to breaking even, eventually you got to run out of money. And, I just realized that for one, I didn't like being the money guy. Let's put it this way. I was friends with all the bands, and one of the bands in particular I was friends with, I went to a show they were playing, and a bunch of their, let's put it this way. Basically, a bunch of the friends, a bunch of the whole, the scene that they were involved with, they had been doing really well, and they were starting to ask me, coming up to me at the show, and so when you're putting out, the new record for them, it's like, well, dude, hold on, the record's only been out for 6 months, man. It's an EP, but we gotta wait. They gotta tour a few times, and and it was I started realizing that I wasn't necessarily this guy who was a friend and being involved in helping them out. I was the guy that had the money. Even though I didn't have money, I had enough money where I was supporting, the label. But that's what I was looked at. And to me, I was like, well, I didn't get into this to be, I didn't, first of all, get into it to make money. And I definitely didn't get into it to people look at me like I had money or that I was that guy. And I started realizing that's what it was when I was around people. It's different. You don't know if these people, are they cool with you because you're, footing a bill for their music, or do they really like you? And my whole thing was I did it more as a community thing, man. I just always looked at metal and music as a community thing. I don't look at it just like, we'll talk about it a little bit, but just like we do with the podcast, we make no money off that stuff. It's all for the love of the music. And, so my whole thing was just like, I started realizing people were looking at me as like, oh, I'm the business guy. I wasn't just the friend who loved the music and was a buddy. I was the guy with the money now. And I didn't like that, man. That made me feel uncomfortable. I'm just not, I'm not driven by money, and I don't like to be, looked at as that guy. So I started, reevaluating things, and I just realized like this is tough. It's costing me a lot of money that I'm in debt to, and is it still worth it to keep going? Especially that I'm not seeing any return on my investment, and you need that in order to keep going as a record label. You just need that, I mean, I didn't have an endless bank account to fund everything. So I just decided at that point, what happened was basically the day I decided to stop, it was, we were doing a follow-up for a band on my label, the band Count Time. And I won't get into all the details, but it didn't go well in the end. We were recording the second record at a nice studio in North Hollywood. I mean, Logan Mader was there recording with for that Media Scare label. We got hooked up. It was a real good hookup. We got into the, inside the studio, and the band who was recording, I started realizing, they'd come late a lot of times, and my money was going down the tubes, man. This shit wasn't cheap, and I realized like, I just couldn't do this anymore. It wasn't fun. It was stressful. I didn't want to be stressful, but not fun. I don't mind if it's stressful, but it has to be somewhat fun where I'm enjoying it. And I realized that, this just isn't, and like I said, in that time, nobody was buying CDs, man. And I really didn't know how else to sell it. I wasn't really privy in that time, with the streaming enough to where I can make enough money to survive just off that. So that's when I just decided, I have to just close up shop. and regroup and figure out what I'm going to do next, in the music business.
And were you working like a current day job during these times, or was it just
Yes.
you were just solely relying on the label? Okay, so you
No,
were.
yeah, I was working full time. Yes, absolutely. So that on top of it too, yeah, it was a lot of work, man. Yeah, absolutely.
What were you doing around this time, if you don't mind me asking? Like your total day job?
Yeah, my day job, like I've been doing, since for the last, since 2006, 2006, 14 years as a teacher.
That's amazing that you have a degree in marketing and you're a teacher.
I had a special ed teacher too, yeah. Well, once again, man, like getting those degrees was the only reason why I got them was not because I wanted to be some marketing business guy making a lot of money on Wall Street or whatever. I wanted to work in the music business. And so I thought, well, I'm working at this college. I had gotten a job there just doing some, little stuff there. But the thing that was cool about it is you got free tuition. So I was like, well, I could get these degrees and that'll give me like a bit of maybe on my resume might give me a little bit of advantage over people who are looking to apply for the same jobs I was doing in the music business. So that's the reason why I did those. It had nothing to do with me wanting to be a businessman at all. Yeah.
Well, no, I'm just saying it's just funny that you're a teacher because sometimes obviously need a degree obviously to be a teacher most of the time.
Yes.
Now let's go to 2011 to say 2015. What were you kind of doing around this specific time period, and where were you living?
Okay, that's good. Yeah, perfect, man. 2010 is when I moved up here to the Bay Area. I had, it was for, I got a job. I got a hook up here. I think because I kind of wanted to get out of LA at the time, man. I'd been there for 8 years. I wanted to get back into the music business. I was trying to figure out how to, and I just kind of, I was visiting up here one day, and I'm like, man, I really just kind of, I need to get out of LA. You know what I mean? Because LA is just one of those places when you're in the midst of it, when you're in Hollywood in that area, which I was for 8 years, it's just a different world there, man. And so to live there, after a while, especially when, here it was, I started this label, it failed, and I was feeling a little bummed. I just needed a change, and so. I liked it up here. I'd visit here, a couple of times. I thought it was cool. I know they had a good, music scene up here. At the time too, the whole, stoner and doom thing was starting to really happen up here. And, so I came up here in 2010. And so, I came up here and my whole thing was, okay, I'm going to regroup and I'm going to do something else again. And I was thinking about doing the label again, and I was going to do it differently. I was going to do it more so just maybe releasing vinyl or just doing maybe special releases, just like limited release kind of things, just to kind of see where that would go. And then, but like I said, I came up here. I didn't want to just jump into that again. So I was like, well, instead of me, I can't take out loans anymore. I'm going to save some money and then maybe get back into doing that. At the same time, I also wanted to start doing a radio thing. I was really thinking like, what's missing is there's no outlets for a lot of the younger bands. There's no, outlets for certain genres. It kept shrinking. The whole metal music business kind of world was shrinking a little bit. It was made up still of a lot of people who'd been in it for years, but I didn't really notice a lot of new, younger people getting into it in terms of opening labels and stuff. So I was thinking I could come up here and maybe, get into something like that. And so that's what got me, coming up here. That's why I'm here today. It was to come up here and sort of get back into the scene. And at the time, it was really, like I said, I was really, being a little bit older at that time, I was really starting to like a lot of that 70s stuff again. I was getting into bands in the 70s I didn't even know of. And so I was kind of really into the doom and the stoner stuff. And so there was some stuff going on up here. So I came up to the Bay Area.
Interesting. That's very, so obviously, and especially around this time, there's around the Bay Area, the thrash scene for the old school is kind of booming because you have new school thrash bands. You also have a prevalent death metal scene,
sure.
Somewhat there as well. Now, I'm just curious, as far as media outlets in the Bay Area around this specific time period, what was there, just besides bands and venues? Were there other people like kind of doing what you wanted to do?
Not really. I mean, there was a couple of, what I realized is when I started going and started to immerse myself in the scene, it's a real different scene up here, just in terms of, I think, like the energy level than it is in Southern California, and even in New York. It's really mellow up here. You know what I mean? It's a good scene. It's a good scene, but it's not as energetic, and at first I thought I was going to like that. And then I realized like, well, no, it's kind of really laid back, man, like really laid back up here, I mean, you could go to these shows here and people they'll be standing, they don't even move, man. It's really different. I'm not putting it down or nothing. I'm just saying it's different. I started realizing like, okay, what happened is when I came up here, I really thought I was coming up to something that was like, I was I was in the middle of, before it became big, I was going to get in on it. But by the time I did get here and I was able to start thinking about it and start planning it out, it just took off. I mean, the whole stoner thing just got, huge. And then by that time, it was like, man, once again, there's a bunch. It wasn't so much there was labels up here, but it was all these labels overseas that you're competing with. So there's, labels like Heavy Sight Sounds over in, Italy. And let's see, what else is there? I mean, that's the main one. But there was all these labels. I mean, even, like there was a couple of bands up here. For instance, there's this band up here. I don't know if you ever heard of them. They're called Orchid. Real, just almost like a bass, Black Sabbath type of band. Yeah. So they were big up here, but nowhere else except for in Europe. And I started realizing like, wow, but that even though there's a scene here, there's not really like just put it this way, the LA scene's a lot better. And I thought it would be different. I thought up here would be better, but it's not. So I wasn't sure. I was like, man, do I really want to start, putting all this money into this stuff again when I'm not really sure where this is going to go? I'm like anything, man. I'm not like, I don't, I don't have a lot of money, but whatever money I have saved for this, I want to make sure this time I'm going to spend it, in the right place. I'm not going to just throw it away. And so I decided to just take my time. You know what I mean? It's like one of those things that's just, I learned from the last time, man, be patient. Don't just jump at signing bands just because you might like them or, something might, whatever. You have to really pay attention to in terms of, do they want to tour? That's the big thing to me with bands is, do you want to, and I'm not talking about touring, the globe or cross country even, just at least up and down the coast. And, some of the bands I was looking at here, it was more of just it wasn't a serious thing. They might tour, up in Portland once, but that's it. You know what I mean? Maybe do that or do a weekend tour once a year. That's not enough. In order if you're going to, put out a record for someone, they've got to, they got to tour a little bit more than that. I mean, especially if it's in their area, they've got to tour more, or play shows more than once every 3 months. So I just decided I was going to really study the scene and just take it in and really wait instead of jumping the gun. And so the stoner scene thing was huge up here, but obviously a couple of years later, I'm glad I didn't jump into it because it sort of died down after that. And even though it's still kind of good up here, it's not as good as it was 10 years ago, just like nothing is, right? I mean, any scene isn't. So, that was just kind of the thing. I just really, I'm glad I waited because I probably would have done something stupid and just kind of grabbed the band just because I wanted to have a label again. And then all of a sudden, lost my money again. So I wanted to take my time, you know what I mean? So that's why I haven't even done it until this day because, with the label.
Absolutely, man.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into your next venture and how you kind of just came to find it. And what I'm talking about is the podcasting thing. So,
sure.
There's a lot of ventures in the music community is what I'll call it, right? You got labels, you got now podcasts / radios, you got musicians. So how did you personally come into the podcast world?
I've always wanted to be in radio, man. If there was one thing in music I wanted to do, it was more than anything was radio as a kid. And I started realizing there was, podcasts going on. And so I, shortly after I moved up here, I had an idea in my head. Okay, I remember seeing a couple of these online radio stations through Live 365, at the time. And they turned me on to so much music, but no one was really actually doing, they were playing songs on there, but they weren't doing shows or nothing. It was just basically a big playlist. But I was like, wow, man, this is cool. So, I mean, it was like, it wasn't that much money to pay per month to do it. So I started just having this thought in my head, like, I'd love to create sort of this underground music, because I was always into underground independent music, more so. I mean, I'd rather talk to the, most obscure band, anywhere than talk to some big band. I just prefer that. I like discovering and talking to, bands and musicians that are up and coming. It's just something I have a passion for. So I had this idea of like, I could open this, radio thing on Live 365. I could put all types of metal on there and, I can make, have some shows on there. I had this whole idea. So I started, befriending some people up here, and some of them were down with doing it with me. And then one of my friends, we decided we were going to do a podcast. We started doing this podcast. We didn't really put it out there much. It was sort of like trial podcasts. You know what I mean? We would get together, have a couple beers, and then we would just put together a show, see how it sounded. All right, well, that sounded not good. We'll change this next time, whatever. And we started doing that for a little bit. It was fun. And so I was like, man, I really want to get into this. It was really something I was planning on doing. So I started a few years ago. I built a site for it and everything. It was called BetweenRockandAHardBass.com. Unfortunately, the Live 365 platform we had at the time, which had been around for like 18, 20 years or something, it closed down, shut down because of there was some law, some law in Congress, some government thing that they got rid of what they were able to do in terms of streaming music online and paying not obviously not the best royalties to these bands, but it was legal,
a standard flat fee or whatever. They probably got rid of it. Gotcha.
Exactly. So now, exactly. So whatever it was, is they just boom, they were done, and I'm like, fuck, man, that killed my whole plan on everything, man. So it sucks. I was kind of bummed for like a year. I was like, what am I going to do? So I just tried to, think of some things. Well, within a year, about a year and a half, 2 years later, Live 365 came back. Not as good as it was, now, but it was like, okay, it's something. I want to do this again. Let's go ahead and let's do it up again. So I restarted it, and that's when, I had this idea, and like I said, I put together that site. And then luckily for me, I wound up, once again, I got in touch with my old friend, Bob Nalbandian, when he was up here doing his, Bay Area Godfathers DVD. And, I had known Bob, from, back in LA when I was doing my label. He just started Skull Sessions, and I remember discovering it, and he interviewed it was Monty Connor and someone else, and I remember just writing him a message like, oh, dude, Monty Connor is like my idol, man. I always wanted to be an A&R guy. That's the guy, man. Like, that's great, great podcast you got here. And then he just wrote back, and we started talking, and then he had just started Skull Sessions, and he was trying to put together a website for MySpace. We're talking about MySpace days now. He was like, yeah, I don't know how to. I'm not really good with technology. Do you know how to do any of these MySpace things? I was like, yeah, dude. I'm like, you want me? I can make you one, man. No problem. And so we just started becoming friends, and then he had moved back down to LA at that time, and we hooked up, and we started. We became good for pretty good friends, and we go to shows together, and then soon after that, I moved up here. And then, Bob wound up moving up here, like I said, about a couple of years ago, 3 years ago or so. And we reconnected. And then one day we're hanging out, went to see a show, whatever, having a couple of drinks. And then I told him, I was like, dude, man, you should get back Skull Sessions, man. It's such a great podcast, man. He's like, I know I want to do it, man, but I just don't have, the time. Cause he's real busy, Bob, doing all his projects. And, I said, yeah, dude, well, if you want me, I could always, I'm here to help you out. But I would love to, help you out if you need some help. And he was like, yeah, dude, totally, man. He's like, why don't we do it? And so we went to see the band Power Trip. We went to a Power Trip show. We talked about it, and then we're like, let's do it. And that's how Skull Sessions became, came back pretty much.
I love it. I love it. And I also love the fact, too, that both you have connections to Roadrunner, which is really cool without you guys probably even knowing it, up until that point, right?
Well, when we met each other, that's another reason why we kind of, became friendly in LA was, I told him, like, oh yeah, dude, Monty, whatever, that's great. I interned there, whatever. And he was like, oh shoot, dude, I worked there. He, Bob ran the LA office in the early 90s. So yes, we had that connection as well, which definitely helped us, kind of bond when we first, started hanging out, when I was still in LA. Yeah, totally.
And now, who was your first guest between you and Bob Nalbandian? Like, who was your first specific guest to come on and basically bring back Shockwaves Skull Sessions?
Well, it was funny because, like I said, we were sitting there like, okay, a whole thing was like, let's just get it started again. We had all these ideas we were going to do, whatever. And then, obviously Bob, Bob knows everybody, in the business. And so, he was just like, I'm going to put out feelers to everybody. Cause I guess, a lot of people had been hitting him up for years being like, hey dude, man, I really wish you get Skull Sessions back. And of course, like Bob said, he wanted to do it. He just didn't really have, the time and to do it by himself and everything. So, we just, he already had like a list of people that he knew wanted to be on it, So, I remember the first episode we did was just me and him, just a little, we're back kind of, or he's back kind of thing. And I'm on board with him now. And I think our first guest was his buddy, Pat Scott, who was, a guy who, grew up, but when Lars, moved from Denmark to the States and he moved to Huntington Beach, he befriended this guy, Pat Scott, who was a good friend of Bob's. And I guess he was, he had known Pat was friends with, I guess Lars for a couple of years through high school and stuff. And I guess, so it was just sort of like in the beginning, it was like, okay, let's ease it back into just like talking with, some of Bob's friends or some, like Monty Connor, I think was one of the first episodes. Martin Popoff, I think was on as well. It was, once again, what we wanted to do was, my thing was I always loved Skull Sessions because it wasn't just musicians. They had the A&R guys on there. They had, just a lot of the music business people. You know what I mean? So, I kind of wanted myself to do a podcast, interviewing those guys. And I was planning on that until, like I said, I connected with Bob, but he was like, well, that's what Skull Sessions is, which it is. And so it was just easier to go, well, let's just get that going. Let's get those guys back. Let's get, Ian Christie was on, the author, Howie Abrams, another, huge A&R guy, that was with Roadrunner in the 90s and, big in the 80s with the crossover seed. And, so we started like to just try to get more of the industry people, the A&R guys, the authors, the journalists, those kind of guys that Bob had, that Bob's been friends with for a long time. And then, of course, it was like, okay, we talked about what else can we do, with it. Well, of course, we're going to get some musicians on. And I think the first guy we got was Craig LaCicero, from Forbidden. He came into the studio here. I built a studio too in my house, for Skull Sessions. So we got like, a nice studio in here that we do everything from, when we can, when people are in the Bay Area, we try to get, as many guests in here as we can. And, we just knew we had to step up, a little bit the game because the podcast had seen it change so much, obviously, since Bob started Skull Sessions, back in the mid 2000s.
Absolutely, and I specifically love what you guys do. I've been a big fan for a number of years now, and I'm just kind of curious, kind of where you are personally now in terms of your podcasting, and in terms of, say, your music. Do you still play music? Do you still play in bands or anything, or is it strictly just the radio / podcasting thing right now?
Yeah, in terms of playing, I mean, I just fuck around, at home and stuff, that's pretty much it. And like I said, me and my brothers, yeah, they'll come up. They're still in LA. They'll come up and we'll jam, we'll record songs. It's mostly for fun. You know what I mean? But yeah, my energy and all my, everything is going into the podcasts, between Skull Sessions and Aftershocks. Definitely it's, it'll keep you busy between those two. Yeah, I loved, like I said, I give Bob all the credit in the world. Obviously, Aftershocks we got going on now, with Chris Aiken for the Classic Metal Show, which has been, if it wasn't for Skull Sessions, I wouldn't have really connected with Chris. Obviously, I connected, to him through doing a few episodes with him on Skull Sessions. We both just realized that we had the same passion. We really, as much as I love the classic stuff and I love talking about it and being involved with it, we're the type of guys, man. We like to look forward. You know what I mean? I love, listening to nostalgic stuff. I mean, I do all the time, but in terms of promoting and talking, I love, talking about new music. You know what I mean? And it's like, we saw that there's this vacuum or this void where we don't see, not so much podcasts, but we don't see anything really in general in terms of media where they're really giving a lot of like focus on the newer bands, and not just giving focus onto newer bands, but featuring them alongside already, established and proven artists. Like for instance, in Aftershocks, we've had like, Void Vader, band like that, a great band that, people are starting to know about, and they would have, unless this pandemic didn't happen, they would, be really big. I'm sure they were doing that tour before the whole thing happened, but we want to give, I said, a platform for those kind of bands. You know what I mean? Like, cause there's not much out there for them. You know what I mean? Like we were, obviously messaging about this yesterday, and it's like, we love, new music. We're always looking for new bands to explore, to find. And you just don't see, to me, it's in the podcasting world, what I mainly see, and I'm not bagging on it, but I see everyone focusing on the same thing, talking about, Kiss and Twisted Sister. And I mean, listen, I love those bands. I mean, they're a big part of what I grew up with, but it's old to me. It's just old news to me. I'm excited to see what's coming next and what's going on now compared to, hearing about what Dee Snider's doing on his new record. I can really, I'm not bagging on it, but it's just, I don't really care about that. I mean, I really want to focus on the new bands and give them a platform alongside a lot of the other bands from the past that are still around that don't get a lot of notoriety, especially here in the States. You know what I mean? I mean, yeah, Europe's great for that. I mean, Europe does a great job. They never forget, their bands that they loved and, as a kid. They're lifelong fans. For some reason here in the United States, a lot of metal fans, they either fade away from metal in general, or they just sort of stick to the bands they know, and they're more narrow minded. You know what I mean? They don't want to. I think there's a lot of fans that aren't like that, and that's what we're trying to get in touch with those fans. Is we just, like I said, we wanted to focus on something that's more modern and not so much classic metal, and that's really what Aftershocks is all about.
Absolutely, that's what Poppet's Corner is about too, and
exactly,
and Razor, what I do too.
Yep.
And it's not just because I play in a band; it's because I experienced it firsthand, where like I wasn't getting opportunities to fucking be heard, so. In order to to have change, you got to be the change, and so that's what I started focusing on, was to be the fucking change, And I'm glad that we're both doing it, in all honesty. And I, lastly, before I let you go, man, thanks so much for giving me, a couple minutes of your time here, and just give me, tell us some links to where people can, find, Aftershocks and Shockwaves Skull Sessions.
Sure. Well, of course, Shockwaves Skull Sessions, you can go to shockwaveSkullsessions.com. Also, Shockwaves Skull Sessions, podcast on all the social media sites. Obviously, we put out an episode every week. As you know, with Skull Sessions, too, like I said, it's really... if you love a lot of the 70s and early 80s stuff or mid 80s, stuff, all the classic metal hard rock stuff, man, that's Skull Sessions. It's great. Obviously, Bob, Bob, he's, I call him the Armenian maven of metal. That's who he is, man. He's a encyclopedia of metal, from back in those times, man. And he's a, great guy to, I'm blessed to be on Skull Sessions, to co-host that and to, produce it and be part of it. I'm real lucky. And then, of course, Aftershocks is aftershocks.podcast.com. We got all our, we got about 30 episodes up there, right now. We do 2 a week, every Monday and every Thursday. We're also doing now every other week. We're doing a live, it's called Tremors Live, Aftershocks Tremors Live. We just had last week the Pearl Jam drummer, original Pearl Jam drummer, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame drummer, Dave Cruzen was on with us. We have another lineup next week. I think it's, we had a couple guys coming on. I think it's Elias from Nonpoint. What we're doing with Aftershocks now is it's becoming more now of a TV thing. We're going to have an app now. We're going to have it on, it's already coming up on Roku on Thursday. We'll be on Roku. We've got it on Amazon. So it's everywhere. Aftershocks is everywhere. We're trying to make that more of a TV sort of thing now, more visual. And then once again, we want to focus with that. We want to get, more the modern bands on. That's one of the reasons we're doing that too, is to showcase and give some attention to bands like your band, you know what I mean? Like Madrost, you know what I mean? So that's aftershockspodcast.com, social medias, at AftershocksPod1. And, so hit us up on there if, you have any questions with that. And, man, well, thanks so much for letting me, talk your ear off here, man. I hope
absolutely.
I didn't,
no, absolutely.
bore you too much.
I want you to come back on and to have some more discussions with me. I greatly appreciate it. Well, another episode of Poppet's Corner, guys. I'm out of here. Cheers.